do that. Okay, so the question that always comes up is when will the recording be available? So the answer is that this is being recorded and should be available usually Monday or Tuesday. Our director of marketing, Mark Flaherty, will send out a link to all the registrants that will allow anybody to access the video on YouTube. So that's the usual procedure. The other thing I always say before I get started is that everybody is muted by default, so I cannot hear you, but you can hear me, hopefully. And hopefully you can see my screen as well. If you either if you can't hear me or you can't see my screen, please let me know by typing in the chat box or the question box, whatever you see on your screen there, and let me know, and I'll see what I can do about it. And that is the way that you can communicate with me during the webinar. You can chat or ask questions, and I'll see them pop up on my screen. And sometimes I might not see it when it happens. It's a little hand that pops up on my screen. So if after after a few 30 seconds or so, if I don't respond in any way to your question or your chat, try again. It probably just means I didn't see the little symbol pop up. Okay, well let's get started now. My name is David Fass, and I'm the trainer at InetSoft, and we do these webinars on some basic topics. In this case, not so basic a topic, every month or so. And so this is the latest in the series. All of the previous ones are available on YouTube as well. So so when you get the link for this one in the email, if you go to where that link is, you'll find all of the past videos as well for last year and this year are on YouTube in the same location. And today's topic is database writeback. So database writeback is actually an advanced topic, not really a basic topic, and so we're going to cover it at kind of a high level. Can't get into all the details in the time that we have. The first thing to note about database writeback, well, the first thing to note is what is it? What it is a way for users of a dashboard to submit data back to the database. Right, so if you've watched any of our previous videos or if you've worked with the product, you know that basically dashboards are for viewing and for interacting, right? So you open up a dashboard and you can make some filtering selections and slice and dice the data, view it in different ways, export it, print it, all those kinds of things you can do with a dashboard, but you never change the data in the database, right? It's always a one-way street, right? The data comes from the database and gets displayed in the dashboard where you look at it in different ways, but you never send data from the dashboard back into the database. In general, in most cases, you don't want to, right? In most cases, your database administrator would probably not appreciate random users writing, changing data in the database. So generally, dashboard doesn't do that. However, there are cases where you might want your users to be able to submit data back to the database, right? So a user is viewing a dashboard and maybe they see some incorrect data in the dashboard, or maybe they want to add some data or delete some data, right? And so how do you do that? Well, that's where this feature comes in, database writeback. Now, what I was going to say is the first thing, really the second thing that you need to be aware of with regard to database writeback is that this feature requires a special license, right? So after we're done with this webinar, if you get all excited about it and boot up your system and try to implement your own version of database writeback on your system, chances are that you're not going to be able to do it because it does require special license. So if you see the high-level view that we're giving of this and it's of interest to you, you can certainly contact your account manager and discuss the licensing considerations. And they can also talk to you more about whether this is the feature that you really need, or whether your needs could be met some other way. But it is important to note that this does, unlike all of the other topics that we've discussed in this webinar, database writeback does require special licensing. So with that said, let's take a look at how this works. And I'm going to break this up into 3 different parts. The first part is easy. The second part I would consider advanced, and then the third part is difficult. And the reason for that is that when we get to the third part, what we're going to be talking about is actually writing data back to the database, and that is complicated, right? I mean, generally you have professionals who deal with that, who deal with setting up queries to write data and add records, delete records, those kinds of things. And so we're going to be doing that here. So that is by its nature a complex task, and the way that we do it is complex. So, so again, we'll give the high-level view. So let's get started with that lengthy introduction behind us. So I have a Visual Composer open here. Hopefully everybody can see it. And what I want to show you first is what we're looking at here. Well, let's first look at the dashboard. Right? So here what I have in Visual Composer is a dashboard. And this dashboard has just a single table because, oh, there's a question. I saw a hand go up. Let me see if I can. This happens sometimes. I see a hand go up and then I can't find the question. Give me one moment. Okay, well, if somebody had a question, please ask again. I can't see it right now. So what we're looking at here, I'm in Visual Composer. I'm looking at a simple dashboard with just a single table because I want to keep this very simple. And what I want to do is I want to rig up this dashboard so that an end user will be able to change some of the values in this table and submit the changes back into the database so that the changes will actually change the records in the database so that anybody who subsequently comes along and views the dashboard, or for that matter, anybody who subsequently comes along and views a different dashboard that's based on the same database will see those changes because the changes will actually be written into the database tables themselves. So what I want to illustrate before we see how to do that in the dashboard is that this dashboard is based on a worksheet, right? And here's the data worksheet that's behind the scenes. And what this data worksheet does is it takes two tables from the database and joins them together, right? So in the actual database, there is an orders table, right? Just like you see here with just these fields. And also in the database, there's a sales underscore employees table, just like you see here. Right? And so what I've done in the data worksheet is I've joined them together to basically get all of the columns, right? And so here's the, if you want to look at the actual data, here's the actual data. It's all of the columns from these two database tables that I've integrated into a single table. The reason that I wanted to do this is to show why this becomes complex. Because when you construct, in the third part of this, the difficult part, when you construct the SQL statements that will write the data back into the database, right, you have to know what database tables to write to. Right, so the dashboard that we're going to be looking at is based on this joined table, right? But if you want to, right, if you want to make modifications to the database, you have to know that you're not changing, the changes in the database that you need to make are not changes to this table called orders table. The changes that you have to make are changes that have to be written back into the orders table and the sales employees table in the database. So I'm pointing out here that you need to have a lot of knowledge in order to be able to set this up, a lot of knowledge about where the dashboard is getting its data from, and a lot of knowledge about the database, the structure of the database itself. Okay, now we'll leave this worksheet behind. I don't think we're going to come back to this, and let's go and take a look at the dashboard. So the first part is the easy part. Before we do that, if I just do a preview of this, right now there's at least I don't think I have the feature enabled. So this is just a regular dashboard, right? It's the dashboard with a table, right? And this is the way a user would see it. I'm previewing it in the Visual Composer, but this is the same way that the user would see it in the user portal. And you can see that the table is not editable in any way, right? You can scroll through, you can look at various, you can see what there is, but it's just a table, right? No modification possible. So the first thing and the easiest part in getting this all to work, getting the user to be able to submit, to change data in the table and submit it to the database, is to enable table editing. Right, so what you do is back in the design view of the Visual Composer, you right-click on the table, you select Properties, and if you have the appropriate license installed, there'll be a property called Enable Table Editing. Right? If you right-click on a table and you open a table and you don't see that property, it probably means that you don't have the right licensing. right? So that's something that you'll have to look into then. So the first thing, the easiest thing, is that you turn on table editing by enabling that property. And you can see that there are three sub-properties: add rows, delete rows, and edit rows. And these are global, basically global flags that control what the user can do on this table. And it's pretty self-explanatory. If you enable add rows, that means the user will be able to add new rows into the table. If you enable delete rows, then the user can delete existing rows from the table. And if you enable edit rows, then that just means that the user can change existing rows. And you have to keep in mind that really all that you're controlling here is what the user can do to the table in the dashboard, right? This does not affect at all what's going to happen to the database, right? That comes later. That's part 3, right? Part 1, we're just setting up the interface, and this just controls what operations the user can do on the table, not anything related to the database at all. Okay, so we're going to turn that on, and in this case, I'll leave all 3 options on, and then press OK. Okay, so now the table is editable. Then the next part of part 1, all right, so we're still on part 1, the easy part. The next thing you do is you set the column editing constraints, right? So now if I were to, if I preview this now, right, so if I do preview, right, and if I click on a cell now, you'll note that I can actually edit the data in any cell that I click on. Right, so now this table has become editable. Right, so I can make modifications. For example, I can change this 10 to an 11 or something like that. I can make changes to this table. You'll notice that if I make a change to a row, it gets highlighted in yellow. I can also delete rows. Right, so if I right-click on a row, I have a delete rows option. Right, that deletes the row. Obviously, there's no highlighting in that case because what would you highlight? The row is gone. And you can also add rows. So I can right-click and I can select insert row or append row, and the new row gets highlighted in blue. Right. So that's the effect that we achieve just by turning on table editing. And again, it has nothing to do with writing anything to the database. The changes that you make here, at least at this point, will never get to the database because there's no logic implemented to write these changes to the database. So all I'm doing is just changing the appearance of the table, but if I were to reload the dashboard, all those changes that I make, the inserted row, the changed data, the deleted row, those all go away because they've never been saved anywhere, right? So that's part A of part 1, the easy part. Part B of part 1 is that you can set constraints for the data that the user can enter into the different columns. So for example, for a date column like this, what you would do is you would right-click on the column header and select column option. And then this gives you the ability to select the type of input that the user will provide. In this case, the input will be, let's say, dates, right? So you would select the date editor because it's a date column, and you select a minimum and a maximum date. So for example, I don't know, beginning of 2011, and well, that's not quite the beginning, but so April of 2011, and let's say, the beginning of 2015 or something like that, or rather the beginning of this month, 2015. All right, so you set some constraints. You can supply an error message, and basically this message will pop up. This message will pop up if the user enters a date outside that range. All right, so you enter an error message and you press OK. And basically what that does is, if we preview this again, it just means that if the user tries to enter a date in that column that's outside the range, right? So you can see that when you set a date editor for the column, it means that when the user enters a value in that column, they're going to get a date widget, so they can click a calendar to enter the date. And if I try to enter something outside that range, let's say something from 2009, right? So I get that error message, and it says whatever I put for the message, enter a good date, right? Probably what you'd want to do if you were doing this is, actually give the user a little bit of a hint as to what they can enter, because how would the user know what a good date is? But you get the idea. And you would do the same thing for all the other columns, right? So for order ID, you might do a column option, set that to integer editor. Here again, you can set a minimum and maximum and an error message. I'm not going to bother setting everything. Customer ID also might be an integer. Employee ID might be an integer. First name and last name are strings, and that's the default column type, right? So that's the default column editor, so I'll just leave those as they are. This guy, paid TF, is a Boolean column, so what I would do is I would select the Boolean editor, which will basically give a check mark, right? So I'll show you in a second, but if you have a Boolean editor, that means when the user modifies a value in that column, they're going to have a check mark, which they can turn on or off. And then region, here again, region has to be 1, 2, 3, or 4, so we might set this as a integer editor with a minimum of 1, maximum of 4, and say something useful like number between 1 and 4. Okay, so I think everybody gets the idea of how this works. Okay, and then for a discount, you might do something like a float, right? Because a discount can be a floating point number, and again, you can specify minimum and maximum, let's say 0 and 1. Okay, so I think you get the idea. And then, as I showed you before, if you preview this, the column editor that you set for each column will determine the type of entry, right? So for an integer, you basically get a text editor, but it will check whether the integer that you enter is in the appropriate range. Likewise, for floating point value, so if I enter here something like 3, right, I get the generic error, right? I didn't enter a custom error message, but it gives me a generic error because I did specify that there's a maximum of 1, so entering 3 is not permitted. And then for the Boolean column, you'll note that if you try to edit it, you get a check mark, which you can turn on or off. Okay, so now we've looked at the easy part, which is part 1. So let's move on to part 2. So just to summarize, the easy part 1, is setting up the interface, right? This is the way that the user will interact with the table in the dashboard, right? They can add rows, delete rows, modify rows, and you can set validation constraints on what they can enter into the table. Okay, part 2 is how do you find out what the user did? Right, so the user made some modifications, the user deleted some rows, the user added some rows, right? Somehow now you're going to have to be able to have access to the user's modifications. And the way that's done is in script through a couple of, well, 3 main functions, which I'll show you here on the screen, right? So this is a property of tables. There's a property called getFormRows, and then in parentheses added, getFormRows changed, and getFormRows deleted. And basically what these functions do, these functions exist only for this purpose, right? Just for acquiring modifications that the user made to a table, an editable table. And basically getFormRows added returns an array of the rows that was added. It's a 2-dimensional array. So basically, each row of the array is an added row, and each column of the array is a value, is the corresponding value in that row, right? So a 2-dimensional array of added rows. This one, the changed parameter, gives you back a 2-dimensional array of changed rows that the user modified, and the last one here, the deleted parameter, gives you a 2-dimensional array of the rows that the user deleted. So we can do just a quick illustration of how this works, just so you get the idea. So let's do this by adding a submit button to our dashboard. Right, so what I want to do here is I'm going back to my dashboard, and I'm going to add a submit button, and the idea is just for demonstration purposes, I want to allow the user to make some modifications in the table, and then when they click the submit button, I want to pop up an alert that shows the changes that they made, just so we can demonstrate how you get access to that in script. So I'll add a submit button. If I can find it, there it is, a submit button, looks like this. Make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so there's a nice little submit button. Move it down a little bit. Okay, now what do I do with this submit button? Right now it doesn't do anything, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an on-click script on the submit button. So I right-click on the submit button, select properties, click on the script tab, and you'll notice that there's a, for the button, there's a script option down at the bottom here, and there's an on-click option. What I want is the on-click option because I only want this script to execute when the user clicks the button. So what I'm going to do is, and I hope I'll copy the script into the chat box after I'm done writing it, just in case anybody has difficulty seeing it. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the get form rows changed option, which is this one in the middle, right, to find out what changes the user made and then just display those in an alert. So the way that I'm going to do this is, first of all, I'll capture those changes, the array of user changes, in a variable that I'll call something like rChanged for row changed. Right? And then I'm going to set that equal to the value returned by table view1 dot what is it, get form rows, right? That's the property that we have here, right? Get form rows is the method, get form rows, and in here changed. Okay. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm using this special property and I'm getting the array of rows that the user changed and I'm assigning it to a variable called rChanged. So the variable now has that two-dimensional array. Right, and then what I'm going to do, I'm going to define a variable called string, just start it off empty. str is an empty string. And then what I'm going to do is iterate through this array, iterate through the rChanged array, and just use an alert. An alert is just a dialog box that pops up to display the contents of that array so that we can see what's going on. So I'll just write, I'm going to do this quickly. There's not a lot going on here. It's just a for loop. I'm just going to iterate through all the values in that two-dimensional array and kind of just convert them to a string form so I can display them. So for variable I starts at 0 and I is less than this the length of this array, right? So, oops. Right, so here's rChanged is the two-dimensional array. rChanged.length is the number of rows in that array. So with this first loop, I'm looping through the rows of that array. Again, I initialized this string to nothing. Probably didn't need the first one there. And then I'm going to loop through the columns in the row. So this first part of the loop takes me through the rows in the array, and then my second for statement here is going to take me through the columns. Variable j equals 0, initialized to 0, j is less than, rChanged again is the array, right? The ith, right? So now I'm indexing this array and I'm taking the ith row, right? Because I keeps changing. I is looping. The loop counter variable I is counting through the rows of the array. So now I'm looking at the ith row, and I'm looking at the length of that row, the number of columns in that row, and j++, increment j. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to modify this string variable and just say string is equal to str itself concatenated with rChanged and then the double index ij. And just add a comma. Okay, so basically what I'm doing in this line is, right, so the first loop is going through the rows, the second loop is going through the columns, and then what I'm doing is each time it accesses a new column of the row, I'm just adding the value in that column. So I'm using a double array index here, adding the value in that row and column to this string that I'm building up. I'm just doing a string concatenation here. Again, I don't want to get too hung up on the details here, right, and then and so then once I build up the string, then I'm just going to print it out in an alert, just like this. Whoops. Okay, so hopefully I haven't made any syntax errors here, but again, just to summarize, I'll copy it into the chat box, and then I'll correct any syntax errors if there are any. Okay, so there it is in the chat box. And so again, basically what I'm doing is I'm using this special function, getFormRowsChanged, to get a two-dimensional array of the values that the user changed in the table. Then I'm iterating through the rows, and within each row I'm iterating through the columns, and I'm just building up this string that will have all the values for a particular row, right? Taking all the column values in a row and concatenating them together in a string, and then using this alert function to print out the string. So let's give it a try. We'll find out soon enough if there's a syntax error, which is always possible. Let me just press OK. Okay, and then I'm going to save this, and let's see if this works. So I'll do a preview of the dashboard. Okay. And this script only looks for changes. It doesn't look for added or inserted rows. So I'm not going to bother adding or inserting any rows because the script that I wrote will not detect any added or inserted rows. It will only detect changes. So I'll change Annie to Anne over here. Right, so there's one changed row, and I'll change, let's say I'll change the customer ID here from 8 to 9. Right, so I changed 2 rows. Right, and then what I'm going to do is press the submit button, and it's going to execute that script. And what I hope will happen is that it will it will acquire that two-dimensional array, which should have 2 rows and however many columns we have here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? 2 rows, 9 columns, and my script should iterate through that array and just display in that alert the modified rows, right? So there's the alert that just popped up, right? This is what you get when you use that alert function, and you can see that it has the 2 rows, right? So here's this one is the first row that was changed. I changed that 8 to a 9, right? So this row, it's returning that row in the array, and then the other row I changed was this one over here. I changed Annie to Anne, right? So there's that row. So that's that's part 2 of this process, is basically using those special functions to get arrays that represent the changed rows, the added rows, and the deleted rows. Right? The procedure, we could modify this easily, although I won't. Whoops. The procedure for getting the added rows and deleted rows is basically the same, right? You would just change, instead of get form rows changed, you would put here get form rows added or get form rows deleted, and then essentially the rest of the script could be the same, right? It would give you it would print out the values of the rows that were added, or print out the values of the rows that were deleted, and so on. So that's how you use these functions to get the changes or the additions or the deletions that the user made. And that brings us to part 3. Part 3 is the difficult part, right? So that was the advanced part. Now we're at the difficult part. Let me just make sure that I didn't miss anything. Yeah, I'll show just one other thing here I'll illustrate before I leave this, and that is that if we go back and preview this again, let me just preview this, and I'll make another change here. So I'll just, again, change Annie to Anne. Right, so there's my change, and we know that if I press the submit button, it will display that change. Press OK. The one thing that you'll note is that the highlight on that row that identified that as a changed row did not go away. Right, now, generally, you know, when you get to the point of really rigging this up, you know, in its full glory, probably what you would want is that when the user submits the values, you'd probably want that highlight to go away. Well, you know, again, that's kind of a design decision, but you know, if you don't do that, if you don't make the highlight go away, then it will be hard for the user to know, looking at the table, what values were already submitted and what values were not submitted, and so on. So there's a very simple command that allows you to clear that highlighting, and let's see if I have it on the slide. I think it's on the second page, actually. Yeah, it's this one down here, right? So there's a very simple method or a function called commit. It's a property of the table also, and again, it takes three possible values: changed, added, or deleted, and all it does is that it clears the formatting on the dashboard. Actually, probably doesn't. it clears the formatting and it clears the arrays, right? It clears these arrays, right? So if you want to basically clear out the formatting on the dashboard and you want to clear out the values that are stored up in these arrays, then you can use that property. I'll just show you very quickly how it works. Whoops, need to go back to the design view here. And I'll just add it into this script, right? So after that alert is issued, after that dialog box pops up, then what I want to do here is I'll just use that property called tableview1.commit changed. Okay. Now, the terminology here is a little bit misleading because when you see the word commit, you might think, well, that's the command that commits the changes to the database, but no, it doesn't. Nothing is yet being written to the database. All this does is it just clears this array here, right? This get form rows changed array, right? So after you issue this command, if you were then to again issue the get form rows changed command, it would come back empty, right? So it clears that array out and it clears the formatting on the dashboard. That's all that this command does. So if we go ahead and save this and preview it, then the only difference we should notice when we run it this time is that it will clear the formatting after I press the submit button and dismiss the dialog box. I should see that highlighting disappear, right? So press submit, there's the dialog box, and you can see that the formatting is gone. Okay, so now we're indeed up to the difficult part. So the difficult part is how do you write these changes back to the database, right? And this is where you really need to have a lot of knowledge about your database because you need to construct the SQL string that will be sent to the database, right? And this will the syntax of that will depend on the particular database you're using and probably on some other factors as well. So let me illustrate what this would look like, right? And I'm not going to write this whole script, from start to finish because it would, at the speed that I type, it would take a long time. So I'm just going to go through it on the slide here, and then I'm going to copy the slide into the submit button, and we'll see how it works. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see this slide. The script is basically, this script is not that long because we're dealing with a very simple scenario, and also I'm only going to illustrate committing changes, right? So I'm not going to, even though the script begins by getting both the changes, the added rows, and the deleted rows, in the remainder of the script, I'm only going to commit the changed rows. So I only put these other functions here just so you could see how to acquire the added rows and deleted rows, but I'm not going to do anything with that. So the way a typical script would begin, and again, this script is going to go on the submit button, is that first it creates a connection. All right, so you need to get a connection to an existing data source, right? And the data source that our dashboard, our sample dashboard is based on is a data source called orders writeback, right? That's just the data source that I created yesterday. Right, so you need to know what data source are you writing back to. It has to be a data source that's formally set up on the server, right? So all the database drivers and everything need to be in place. I'm not going to go into all those details now, but that's pretty much the same as for any database that you would set up. So there's nothing unique there, but you use this string in the script to create a connection to a given database. The empty parameters here are for credential passing, right? So if you need credentials to connect to the database, in other words, username and password, for example, right? That's what these other parameters are for. Then the next thing that we do in the script is you find out what was changed by the user, right? Whether the user added rows, changed rows, or deleted rows. Now we understand that because we looked at an example and we know that we have these, really it's just one function, get form rows, but you can access the function 3 different ways to get a 2-dimensional array of the added rows, the changed rows, and the deleted rows. So this will always be prominent in any script that you write for this purpose. But like I said, we're only going to commit the changed rows back. So really, we only need this middle line for this particular script. Okay, next page. How do I get to the next page? Okay, so then you can see here that the only block that I have in this script is one to change the rows, right? To modify the changed rows. I don't have a corresponding block of script for the added rows and the deleted rows. And basically what happens here is that we have this two-dimensional array of rows changed. That's what we got on the first page back here. Right, so here's rows changed. That's that variable. Right, and what you do is you iterate through it, kind of like what we just did in the little script I showed you earlier, and you basically prepare a SQL statement that can have placeholders in it. Right, so here's where your knowledge of the database will have to come in, because you'd have to know how to construct this kind of command. The command here is update, and then the name of the table in the database, right? And then another SQL term set. And then basically what we want to do is, in this example, we're going to let the user change either the first name or the last name. It's the salesperson first name or last name. So you can see this is a very constrained example. Out of the 9 columns in the table, we're just going to let the user change 2 of them, right? And the SQL string that we'll submit to the database is exactly what you see here in quotes. Update this table called sa.salesemployees and set the value in the first name column to something, right? There's a question mark there, and set the value in the last name column of that sales employees table in the database to something where employee ID equals something, right? So it's an incomplete SQL statement, and we're going to fill in the blanks with the next rows of the script, right? So kind of what you're writing here is a SQL statement with some placeholders, right? And the next rows over here determine what goes into those placeholders, right? So here again, we're accessing this rows changed variable. That's the two-dimensional array of values that the user changed in the table. And basically what we're doing is we're saying, you see here the first parameter, the 1, the 2, and the 3, that refers to the first question mark, the second question mark, and the third question mark. So we're saying in place of that first question mark, we want to take the value from the ith row of this rows changed variable and the the third column, right? The columns are indexed from 0. That's why column index 4 is actually the third column, right? So what is that? What's the third column? Let's take a look back at our dashboard, right? The third column, I wonder if that's right actually. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let me just check this. Wait a second. Set string 1. Yeah, actually, yeah. See, this is a typo over here. So 4, right? So this tells me column index 4 is the 5th column, indexed from 0. So 0 is the first column, and so on and so forth up to 4. The index 4 is the 5th column. So what is the 5th column? Right. So take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right. So the 5th column here is the first name. So basically, what this is saying is take the from the ith row of this two-dimensional array of changed rows, take the value in the 5th column and write it into the first question mark, right over here, right? So that's going to then read update sales employees, set first name equal to whatever was in the first name column in this changed rows array, right? And likewise, the 5 over here, index 5, that means the 6th column, which is the last name column. So we'll write the last name that the user changed in over here, and we're going to match which first name and last name are we going to change in the sales employees table. We're going to change the first name and last name where employee ID is equal to the value in the 4th column, right? 4th column, 1, 2, 3, 4, this, right? So basically what we're saying is when the user makes a change to first name and last name, we're going to take those changed values from the two-dimensional array of changed rows, right? We're going to take those changes and write them into the sales employees table in the database where the employee ID is whatever is in the corresponding column here, right? So let's say as a user, I were to make a change to this row here that I'm pointing at, Robert Miller, right? So let's say I changed Robert to Roberta, because I learned that was a typo that somebody made, and this person's name is actually Roberta Miller. Right? So if I make that change, then when that SQL expression gets executed, the SQL expression will say basically update the sales employees table and set the first name and the last name fields in that sales employees table equal to the first name and last name from this row that the user changed right here, where the employee ID in the sales employees table is 3. So that SQL script that SQL string will then look through the sales employees table, find employee ID 3, and change the first name and last name corresponding to that ID to whatever the user entered here, in this case, Roberta Miller. Okay, so that's the way it works. I hope that's relatively clear. And then the rest of this is just housekeeping, right? There's a statement to actually execute the command. There's a statement, this is the one that we looked at previously, that this just clears the changes. And then there's this other statement here that got misformatted. Con is the database connection, and there's a commit command that basically kind of finalizes the, and sends the SQL to the database and finalizes the changes, right? So you've got these two commands, execute update, basically executes the SQL, and then the commit command finalizes it, as it were. And that's the heart of it. And there's one more thing. There's just a little bit of additional housekeeping. Here we basically see, was there an error that occurred in the try block? Remember that the try block begins up here, right? So everything that we've looked at here is in the try block. So if any of that fails, then we can execute some additional logic here, roll back any changes, and then close the connection at the end. And so that's a very basic look at how you would do this, how you'd write back to the database. So let's go ahead and try it. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to put all this in the submit button script. All right, so I'm going to replace the existing commit button script. That was just to illustrate kind of how this stuff works. And I'm going to paste the try block over there. That's not the entirety of the try block, because I need the rest of it. All right, then I'm going to take all this stuff. This example, by the way, a variation on this example is in the documentation. So in case if you're madly trying to copy down any of this, it's probably not worth your effort, because you can look in the documentation and find something very, very similar. Let me just see, some things getting mixed up here. This needs to go there. Some of these things all got onto the same line. Oh wait, this is the way it was. Okay, I'm just going to double check this after I copy in the rest, just to make sure that nothing got accidentally onto the same line. Like here, I think this is on the same line as a comment, so that's not going to work. I just have to find that one. Okay, so I think it's all pasted in. Now let me find, here's this one that got onto the same line as the comment. Then some of the stuff down here got garbled. Might have been quicker just to write this from scratch. I thought it would be quicker to do it this way by copying and pasting, but bear with me a moment. Okay, so I'm just going to scroll through. Again, here's the initial part where we make the connection to the database and we find out what changed, what was added, deleted, and changed. In this case, like I said, we're only going to operate on changes, so I'm not going to worry about what was added or deleted. Then we iterate through that rows changed array. We prepare the SQL statement. That looks okay. And then we do our placeholder substitution from our rows changed array. I think these values should all be correct. 4, 5. I mean, this obviously should. That was wrong before, but that should say 5. Okay, and this should say 3, 4. That should say 6. All right, so it's just the comments that were out of sync. So it takes, column 4 is again 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right, is the first name. Okay, so Right, so the placeholder substitution, again, it just takes the first name and last name that the user changed and plugs that into the first and second question marks in the SQL statement, and then it takes the corresponding employee ID from this is the fourth column, and plugs that into the third of the question marks. That's what this block of logic does. Right, and then that syntax, that SQL statement is ready to go, ready to be sent to the database. That's what happens here. And then the commit the changes, align to clear the formatting from the table, and then the catch in case any of that fails. Oh, and look over here. This down at the bottom, we need to close the connection. Okay, well, let's see if it works. Okay, so I'm just going to select all, copy that. I'll copy it into the chat box, but again, it is more or less in the documentation. It's a more extensive script in the documentation that also lets you see how to do the added and deleted rows, but the procedure is basically the same. So press OK, save this guy, and then what I'm going to do is I'll do a preview. And let's see what happens. Okay, so I'm going to change over here. I'm going to change Robert to Roberta. Right, so you can see there's the change. Right, and then I'm going to press submit. Right, and what I expect the submit script to do is to read that change from the array and then create a SQL statement that will basically say change the value in the sales employees table in the database to the values in this row as they are here, Roberta and Miller, where the corresponding employer ID is 3. So I'll press submit, right? No errors. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh the data in the dashboard, right? So there's a refresh button up at the top, press refresh. Right. And then it's probably hard to see on your screen, but if you look closely, you'll notice that every instance of Robert is changed to Roberta. Right. Let me do another. Let's do another couple changes just to verify that this is working. So I'm going to change Sue. I've got Sue Marston here, and I'm going to change that to Sue Mars. Okay, so there's a change there. I changed Sue Marston to Sue Mars. Right? And again, I'm going to press the submit button, okay, and then refresh the dashboard. Right? And you can see that every instance of Sue Marston is now changed to Sue Mars. Right? So this is a verification that in fact the changes are being written to the database, because why would every value change? Right? The reason that every value of Sue Marston changes to Sue Mars is because that change was written back to the underlying table in the database, right? The sales employees table that has, which is basically a list of the sales employees' first names and last names, right? In that table where previously it had, right? It's actually that table in the database looks like this, right? This table in our data worksheet is directly imported from that the corresponding table in the database. So this is what that table in the database looks like. Right? So basically what's happening when I press submit is that these values are getting changed. Not here, not in the data worksheet, but in the database table. Right? And so since the resulting table in the dashboard, right, is this one, it's built off of this. Right? So if I make a single point change to the sales employees table, that's going to propagate all through this table in the dashboard. Right, and we could play around with this some more, but I think you basically have seen enough, right? So I can change this. The reason, too many letters. Okay, I must have had I wonder why. Let me take a look back. I must have put that in yesterday or something. So if I look at that first name column and go to column option, you see that, I guess I did this yesterday. So I have the editor that I have set up here as a text editor, and I actually put a pattern check. It's a regular expression pattern check. So you can constrain the values that users can enter into a string type field based on a regular expression. And this regular expression only allows I think between 0 and 9 letters. So I'll change that to 20. Right, so that will, then I can save that, and if I preview this again, right, so now I should be able to add as many letters there as I want, up to 20, right, and then again, if I press submit and refresh the data, I'm going to see every instance of Annie change to that. Okay, well, I think that's demonstrated, and I don't need to do any more testing of that. But basically, to summarize, again, this process is really composed of, I like to think of it as composed of 3 parts, right? The first part, again, is just setting up the interface, right? The setting up how the user interacts with the table, right? And that means, first of all, making the table editable. Again, you do that by right-clicking on the table, selecting properties, and turning on table editing and deciding whether, which of these operations you want the user to be able to do, adding rows, deleting rows, or editing rows, changing rows, right? So that's part 1A. And then part 1B is setting any constraints on what the user can enter into a column, right? And you do that by right-clicking on the column header, selecting column option, and then choosing the type of editor that you want, the type of input control, and setting any validation constraints on what the user can enter, right? So that's part 1. Part 2 is acquiring the values that the user deleted or added or changed. And again, the way you do that is by using these script functions here. There it is. These guys, right? So you use these special script functions to get the rows that the user added, changed, or deleted, right? And up to this point, you haven't dealt with anything related to the database, right? So conceivably, you could go this far, and there might be some special case where you want the user to be able to edit a table and make modifications, but not write them to the database, and you could still use all the stuff up to this point. You could find out what rows the user added, changed, deleted, and so on, and maybe write those into a text element or something like that. But my point is that up to this point, you haven't done anything at all with the database. Then the difficult part, the third part, is actually using this information and writing it out to the database. And to do that, we have this kind of complex scheme where you prepare the SQL statements using these placeholders, question marks as placeholders, and then substitute for the placeholders using the values from the array of changed rows, added rows, or deleted rows. And that's basically the whole deal. So I'm going to stop there. I went a little bit longer than I thought, but I guess that's about as deep as I can go into this topic at the moment. And hopefully, it's self-apparent that that you do need to have a lot of knowledge of your database, because you need to construct these statements, right? This is not our syntax. This is basically syntax that your database needs to understand. So this statement here may or may not work on your particular database, right? You'd have to create strings that your database can parse and process. Okay, so I'll stop. If anybody has questions on any of that, please feel free to type in the question box, and I'll see if a hand pops up, or the chat box, whatever you see on your screen. I'll stay online for a couple minutes just to see if there's any questions popping up. Hey, this is fairly advanced, so some of you may just be trying to process it all, but I'll wait another couple minutes and see if there are questions. You can always feel free to email me questions also. My email is david.fass@inetsoft.com. And like I said, this video should be up Monday or Tuesday, and links will be sent out to all the registrants. And also, as I mentioned before, this example is in the documentation, right? So if you search the documentation for database writeback, or committing data to a database, any of those search terms should work. You'll find a more general version of this example that will also look not only at changing rows, but also includes an example of adding rows and deleting rows to the database. So it has the kind of the corresponding SQL for those use cases as well, adding and deleting rows. So so if you're wondering about that part, how do you construct a statement that does that? Take a look at that example. It should help. Okay, well, I don't see any hands going up, so either there are no questions or there are too many questions to be asked online. But if there are, then send me an email. Be happy to respond. Okay, so let me wish everybody a good weekend. I think it is Friday today, so that is the weekend coming up. So have a nice weekend, and hope to see you back here for the next exciting webinar. Bye-bye.